Welcome back. We are talking about the ballot questions, and joining us for more are former Republican State Senator Lisa Carlton, a member of the Constitution Revision Commission, and Frank Alcock, a political science professor at New College. And let me first say that we enjoyed watching you a couple of weeks ago at the Tiger Bay Club, which really you did a fantastic job in terms of explaining these amendments to everyone who was there, because they, in many ways, in addition to who you vote for, as I just said, this has such a profound impact on our lives here in Florida. So let's start with the two of them that touch on public safety one way or the other, and that's Amendment 4 and 6. Taking Amendment 4 first, and that is, Lisa, has been something that's been kicked around for years here in Florida, whether or not to restore the voting rights of convicted felons. It has a lot of bipartisan support, and when we've done shows just on that, we've had a difficulty finding anybody opposed to it, but you do have your reservations.
Well, I think there is another side to Amendment 4. Amendment 4 was put on the ballot by a citizens initiative, and it automatically restores the rights of convicted felons in the state who have done their time and their restitution, paid their restitution. It automatically restores their rights to vote, except in the case of murder or sexual offenses. And I do think the other side of that is there are a number of other felonies that are out in the world today that are very serious felonies. Kidnapping, arson, carjacking. There are certain felonies out there, and it causes one to pause and say, maybe those rights should not be automatically restored. And so I think that it's important for the voter, when they're looking at this amendment, to methodically review both sides of it.
Frank?
I don't disagree with the fact that there might be some carjacking, some violent crimes where the rights are automatically restored at the end of prison sentence plus parole plus probation. I'm not sure what the societal interest is other than punitive or political in withholding these rights after all of that has been completed. So just with respect to not being eligible to vote because of a felony offense, it's 2.5% of the voting age population nationwide, but it's 10.65% in Florida. And if you're a black Floridian, it is a voting age, it's 23%. That's shameful. We're an outlier here in the state of Florida, and we have to change this.
The one thing that I would think that both sides would agree on is our current system just isn't working. It's up to the governor and members of the cabinet, 3 people, to decide whether every convicted felon gets their voting rights back. And Lisa, in some cases, that wait is after a sentence is completed, 5, 10 years, if ever. That obviously what we have now has not worked.
You're right. I mean, I think we would all be in agreement that the process that is in place now is not a very fair process, and it also changes with administrations, which is inconsistent, which is frustrating to people who are trying to get their rights back. I just, I think that it's important to point out that we're now automatically restoring the right to vote in the Constitution. It's a very, very serious provision that would go in the Constitution.
Frank, we only have a few seconds left here. On the flip side of it, the criticism is that this is going to help Democrats a little bit, assuming that a lot of the people who are coming out of the prisons might be Democratic voters.
Yes, but it's just going to correcting an anomaly, which is in the state of Florida, if you happen to be a minority or having a felony conviction, you have lost rights that in 46 other states you have not lost. And so there are some political implications, but it's not as if we're doing something, this amendment is asking to doing something different. It's just bringing us back to where the rest of the states in the union are.
We have to take a quick break. Our conversation on the proposed constitutional amendments continues. Welcome back. We are talking about the ballot questions, and joining us for more are former Republican State Senator Lisa Carlton, a member of the Constitution Revision Commission, and Frank Alcock, a political science professor at New College. And we should just tell people, explain the Constitution Revision Commission. That's where a lot of these questions comes. We do this once every 20 years in Florida. Lisa, you were honored to be named a member of this. I would imagine that was an incredible, long and complicated process.
It was. It was in total about an 18-month process. And again, the Constitutional Revision Commission, as you said, is every 20 years, but it's not only unique in the United States, it's a unique concept in Florida itself. So the CRC is something that you don't see in other states, so a lot of people don't understand what it is. But it was intended to have a thorough review of our Constitution every 20 years.
And I want to talk about the questions more, but let's just explore this a little bit, because it's dominated by Republicans because Republicans control the legislature and the governor's office. Frank, does that really impact in terms of what kind of questions actually get to the ballot?
It does. There's prohibitions through Sunshine Law of gaming it out, but with the governor appointing 15 of the 37, Speaker of the House 9, Senate President, they're appointing people that I think they hope that certain things that are important to the appointers will be moved forward. And so the composition of the commission has certain agendas, I think, in mind that affect what ultimately comes out. But a lot of things come through the process as well, and that's why I think you can't just assume like a no across the board on everything if you're on the politically on this. So you have to take a close look at what they're doing and make judgments on each amendment independently.
All right, so let's talk about Amendment 6 for a moment. And you read this, and it, who wouldn't be in favor of this? Basically, vastly expands the scope of victims' right under the state constitution. It's so often talked about, Frank, that victims in our court system have fewer rights than the accused here. This goes to balancing that out a little bit. But so why are some people critical of it?
There are some folks that are critical of the Marsy's Law in and of itself because they think that it impinges upon the rights of the accused and defendants. I'm going to just park that, though. My bigger concern with this amendment has to do with what was tacked on in the other parts. And there's 3 parts to this amendment. The last part is actually a prohibition on the part of judges of using something known as a Chevron doctrine or Chevron deference in their decisions in terms of anything that involves an administrative agency.
Explain that.
It comes out of a 1984 Supreme Court case, Chevron versus the National Resources Defense Council. It's a precedent. It's not a mandate. It's not something that judges have to use, but it's there. It's a justification for jurisprudence decisions. And what it says is that when there is legislation that is unclear on an issue and an administrative agency makes an interpretation of a statute or a law, that the court or the judges find reasonable, that they should defer to that. It's something that had broad support for a long period of time, including Antonin Scalia thought this was a really good idea. It's contested. Gorsuch doesn't like it too much. It's whether or not the Supreme Court overturns it in the coming years remains to be seen. But for a state to put something in the Constitution that bans a precedent in the Supreme Court, for me, it's a major thing, and they tack this into the back of the Marsy's Law.
I think when you look at Amendment 7, it's a complete package. It's a public safety package. It's a choices on our judiciary. The victims' rights portion of the amendment is a very, very strong provision for victims' rights to have equal rights in our court system, right in our Constitution, just as the criminal defendants do. And the issue that Frank is talking about, basically right now when you go into court, litigants, normally you would think you would walk into court, except in criminal instances where there's a burden of proof, you would walk into court on equal footing, plaintiffs and defendants, so that judges can have, they have an unbiased view of the case, they look at the case, they decide which is right and which is wrong. And this puts that back in place where it should be.
We have to take a quick break. We are just getting warmed up. Our conversation on the proposed constitutional amendments will continue after this break. Welcome back, everyone. We are talking about the ballot questions, and joining us for more are former Republican State Senator Lisa Carlton, a member of the Constitution Revision Commission, and Frank Alcock, a political science professor at New College. So let's talk about Amendment 9. Which is really interesting because it bundles a couple of different things that seem to be unrelated together, like offshore drilling and vaping. When we talk about offshore drilling, Frank, I know that, that's a bipartisan issue, that Republicans and Democrats overwhelmingly in Florida are for limiting offshore drilling for oil off of our state.
It's most of the time. In 2009, 2010, it was a partisan issue. I think there was a lot of politicking going on at that time. The strategy of knocking down the state moratorium in order to get at the federal moratorium. I don't think the interest groups are so interested in going back there, and so for me, the most surprising thing about this is just the broad support on a heavily Republican CRC and then a lack of resistance to it now. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think putting in the Constitution the moratorium for state waters is a good thing. I think the vaping thing, it's a little bit of a strange pairing, but I don't think there's a whole lot of people that feel very strongly in different directions. So, I'm not,
So Lisa, you are for banning of the offshore
Absolutely. Amendment 9 is an amendment that is really going to be a legacy amendment for Florida, if you ask me. I think it's an opportunity for voters to send a strong message to not only the other states, the federal government, but as a statement from Florida itself that we are not in favor of offshore oil drilling in this state. And a resounding 60% will say, you're right, let's vote yes on 9. You know, the coupling with the vaping, basically the vaping section of Amendment 9 is an update to the current Constitution. In 2006, by 70% of the people in the state of Florida, they voted to ban smoking in workplaces, restaurants, workplaces, movie theaters, malls, any indoor workspaces. As you know, what's happened since 2006 is smoking technology has changed. And so now we have e-cigarettes and vaping. And so this is to update the Constitution to include that.
But this is where the criticism of the process comes in. You know, people may be against offshore drilling, but vape and want to vape in restaurants or wherever. Those two things don't seem to have a lot of common, and we talked to Carlos Baruf, or the local developer who was the chairman of the commission before this process started, and he assured us that Floridians would not stand for putting things that are seemingly unrelated together in one ballot question.
You know, Amendment 9 represented our environmental package, which is a choice for the voters. It's an environmental package from the protection of our beach shores, the protection of our sea life, the protection of our tourist economy here. If we don't have our beaches, we have no tourists coming to the state. And packaged with that is an update of the Clean Indoor Air Act. I think that if you looked at the vote from 2006, when 70% of the people said no more smoking indoors, you would see what's happening now is people are sitting in their workspaces and their cubicles all across the state having to inhale the vape from their neighbor next door. And this is simply an update so that we can have a clean, tobacco-free Florida.
All right, there are a lot of other things we want to get to, including the amendment in terms of banning greyhound racing in Florida. I believe that is Amendment
13.
Thank you very much. You know, a lot of people we've kind of gotten to a point that most people don't like what greyhound racing is in terms of concern about the animals, the dogs. On the other hand, the owners of these tracks are in a terrible position that under state law, currently, if they are to have gambling rooms, they must have these races. Why has it been, Frank, so difficult to get this ballot question to the point it's at right now? And what are the opposing arguments and money in terms of trying to defeat it?
Yeah, this is a slippery slope into the weeds on terms of our gambling laws in this state, but 13 at a certain level is fairly straightforward. You're referring to there is a regulatory tether for parimutuel facilities, which are your dog tracks, your horse racing, and highlight down in the southeast, that if they want to have card rooms where you're playing against each other, this is not Title III, you're not playing against the house, you have to have the parimutuel games, which are dog racing, if you want to have the card rooms. There have been attempts to sever that. It's been unsuccessful. This would sever it. It was not really highlighted in the amendment of the language. It almost got it tossed off the ballot, but the Supreme Court let it stay on. So if you're concerned about the card rooms, they will stay. This will sever it. But it's fairly straightforward. It will end dog racing in the state of Florida by 2020 if it's approved.
Lisa?
Well, I think 60% of the people are going to agree that this is not a sport that we want in Florida any longer. It is only here because it is basically a state-mandated business. The state mandates that the greyhounds be raced. Now, that's not an appropriate thing for the state to be doing, but we can't untether the two issues of the card rooms and the greyhounds. This is the only way to stop that.
And we should point out, for any one of these amendment questions to be enacted into law, it has to pass by 60% of the vote. That's different from some of our county questions and city questions, and we're going to get to that in a moment. But there's another question there that deals with a 2/3 majority needed in the legislature to raise taxes. Now, a lot of people would say, well, I'm good with that. This, Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong, was not part of the commission. This was by petition to get it on the ballot.
It was by joint resolution of the legislature that the supermajority issue is on the ballot. So the legislature has put it on the ballot themselves by joint resolution for the people to consider. And I think it's a very strong proposal. I'm definitely in favor of it. I think that in today's world we need to have accountability of our elected officials. And if there's going to be raising of taxes and fees, it should be done by a supermajority.
But here's the question, you know, that sometimes because of fiscal situations like the economic collapse in 2008, legislators are put into a tough position that if the state is in dire fiscal straits, they have to make very tough votes and not popular votes. And this, correct me if I'm wrong, would put the ability to do that in a way that may be beyond, you know, bipartisan efforts on both sides to actually get something done. That has to be done.
Yeah, Lisa and I have sharp disagreement on this amendment. Let's remind ourselves this is Florida. We're not in California. We're not in a high tax state. It's a very fiscally conservative state as it is. But we have some really important issues where you know, raising some fees or looking at options for raising some revenue are really important to some of the challenges that we have to face. Getting both the Florida House, Senate, and Governor to sign off on something like that is tough enough as it is. This is almost the equivalent of giving like a filibuster power for a small minority in either the House or the Senate to block something that most of the state thinks is sensible. And so I'm strongly against
All
that.
right, I want to talk about one other controversial subject, and that is a Sarasota County question, which is basically single member districts. It's been very controversial for years. It's been tried and rejected in the past, Lisa, but make the case that single member districts in Sarasota County, which basically means that if you live in areas like Newtown, you have a commissioner. If you live in Venice, you have a different commissioner. Why is that a bad idea?
It's a bad idea. It reminds me of, you know, the old-timey ward politics, if you will, of days gone by. It's probably, in my opinion, that amendment on the ballot is probably the worst amendment out of all of the state or local amendments on the ballot, because you are directly taking away people's right to vote for 5 county commissioners. Right now, I have the right to vote for 5 county commissioners, and if this passes, it means I only get to vote for 1 county commissioner. And I feel as if our county commission should represent the entire community, and that whether you are from Northport, you should care just as much about Northport as you do downtown Sarasota.
But we have state representatives from Sarasota or Manatee. We send
this is not
one person to
unusual.
Washington.
Higher levels of government, we do it single member districts. Even city levels of government, we do single member districts. The larger counties in the state of Florida do either a hybrid or some form of single member districts. The 3 things that I think that reasons that I am in favor for it is I think it gives more voice to communities such as Northport or Newtown. I think it changes the recipe for getting elected and opens the door to more grassroots-oriented campaigning. It doesn't guarantee anything, but it does change the recipe. You're likely to get a little bit more diversity in the county commission. And I think, and to Lisa's point, I think if in fact you're seeing the vast majority of voters in the county going through all 5 their commissioners and making informed decisions and breaking in different parties, then fine. But I honestly think people just go down R or go down D, and that's not a good thing.
Okay, we have to take a quick break. We'll be back for final thoughts in a moment. And our guest joining us right now for final thoughts. And Lisa, let me start with you, because speaking for your average voter out there, you're not only voting for governor, U.S. senator, Congress, state rep, all this. The length of this ballot is becoming ominous, because now you have 13 ballot questions just on the state issues, not to mention the county and the city issues. How much is too much? What do you know about voters in terms of making it through the ballot A to Z?
You know, we do know a bit about it, and you can term it ballot fatigue is a real thing. Voters get tired of reading the amendments. They get lost in the words, if you will. However, I think that this year is so important for voters to have a plan. Millions will be voting before Election Day in this state like never before because of early voting and then the mail-in ballots. And so there is time for the voters to go and look at these amendments, methodically review them, and and then ask themselves, how do they want their Florida to look for the next generation? Because these 13 amendments are going to affect the next generation of Floridians. And if you want that to be as part of your Constitution, you've got to vote because they have to pass by 60%.
Frank, that's what people should do, but that's not necessarily what people do because, the three of us are really engaged in the political process. We're interested about our community and our state, but there are a lot of people who they just want to go and vote on Election Day.
Yes, but I'm going to have to agree strongly with Lisa on this one. Do you want to have a say in governance in your community, in your state, in your country, or you just want to weigh in on who's representing you and just defer to them for everything? Whether you like it or not, we actually have more of a say in how we're governed here as citizens in the county and in the state than you have in other places. And so while it might be a hassle or a burden for people to work their way through these things, I think it's more of a responsibility, if not a civic duty, to take a little bit of time to weigh in. There are important things that are on your ballot. You're not going to walk into the ballot booth on Election Day and make your way through this. It's important. There are important, significant changes that are just not being done to you. Government, CRC, they're asking permission to do certain things, and I think it's our duty to take a little time. I think you can get through this in about an hour of preparation. Plenty of places that you can go, whether you're partisan or not, to get informed on each of these ballot initiatives. Take the hour, take the time. It's your duty. This is part of a democracy.
Lisa, Frank, thank you very much for joining us. I think we help people, at least give them a primer in terms of what they'll be expecting on their ballot. We want to thank our guests, former Republican State Senator Lisa Carlton, the member of the Constitution Revision Commission, and Frank Alcock, a political science professor at New College.